Hi. Well, good afternoon. I'm Travis Kong from the Sociology Department at Hong Kong U. Welcome to Hong Kong U Research Hub of Population Studies Seminar Series. Okay, launched by the Faculty of Social Sciences, the University of Hong Kong. This research hub actually aims to provide an understanding of local, national, regional, and international trend of demography. This hub actually focuses on interdisciplinary research concerning various population-related issues as well as public policy. And so this population hub actually have many different research clusters. For example, aging, children and family, gender and sexuality, health and mortality, population and development, and urbanization and migration. Today's talk is organized under the research cluster of gender and sexuality. I'm the chairperson of this cluster. And this cluster takes an interdisciplinary approach to understand the shifting nature of gender and sexuality in the globalized world under the various socio-economic political transformations. And it provides kind of like a platform for social scientists to present a cutting-edge research and using both quantitative and also qualitative research methods. The aim is to provide well-being and also enhance social integration and inclusion and diversity in society. Well, today I'm very, very honored, to invite Professor Dennis Altman to come over here to be our guest speaker. So let me very briefly to introduce Professor Altman to you. Professor Altman first came to attention with the publication of his landmark book called Homosexual Oppression and Liberation in 1972. The book was the first serious analysis to emerge from the gay liberation movement and was published in 7 countries with a readership which continues today. He then published many other books, including The Homosexualization of America in 1982, Global Sex in 2001, The End of the Homosexual in 2013, and Death in the Sauna, really interesting title, with a very lovely, sexy postcard last year. Professor Altman is a Vice Chancellor's Fellow at La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia. He was president of the AIDS Society of Asia and Pacific in 2001 to 2005 and was listed by the Bulletin as one of the 100 most influential Australians ever. He is a patron of the Australian Queer Archives and the Pride Foundation. And Professor Altman, Dennis, he actually emailed me a couple of months ago and said, "Oh, Travis, I'm going to Taiwan, but we'll drop by Hong Kong." And I said, "Oh, well, I mean, we come to Hong Kong, why don't you give a talk?" And so that's why I invited Dennis to come over here and to give us a talk today. But then Dennis said, well, I don't really want to kind of give a formal talk, so I just want to kind of give a more personal account about what I actually have been studied over the past decades. So that's why that's the title of today's talk, Gay Liberation Half a Century Later. So please give a warm welcome to Professor Altman.
Is this mic is working? Everyone can hear?
Yes.
One of the things that happens when you get old is you realize that your memories are other people's history. And there's this wonderful part of one's life before, of course, you lose total mental ability, when you can actually recount a great deal of what you've lived through, knowing that is now the subject of people's research. And as I was thinking about what I might say, speaking to an audience in Hong Kong, I'm very aware of the fact that I speak as a privileged white man from a first world country with a very different political environment to the one that you're living in. And very conscious of the fact that I am, to a large extent, very ignorant of many of the pressures and realities of life of people in this part of the world. I do want to talk partly about the origins of what today we call the LGBTQI+ movement. But I also want to reflect on some of the ways in which I've seen that played out outside the Western world, and particularly the experiences I've had through my involvement over quite a very long period in the international AIDS HIV world. So I need to begin with a story, I think, which is that as a young budding academic, I went to New York in the very early 70s with some vague idea that I should find a research project. And I had to find somewhere to live. And I found a shared room in a very big apartment on the Lower East Side when the Lower East Side was not fashionable. And it turned out it was the meeting place for the first gay liberation newspaper in New York. And so suddenly here was I, this young Australian queer, thrown into the middle of the New York gay liberation movement, out of which came the book that Travis referred to. And in a sense, one's first book very often defines the rest of one's career. I've often, in fact, struggled to be allowed to write and talk about things that are not queer. I could, if we were in a different environment, give you a lecture about American politics, but luckily you're going to be spared that. But looking back, what strikes me is the extent to which there was a sudden explosion in the first few years of the 1970s across much of the Western world of what would become known as gay liberation. Now, you're probably all vaguely aware of Stonewall. I assume you've heard of Stonewall, which is the mythical beginning of the American gay liberation movement. Mythical in the sense that there were many other events, and in fact, there were precursors to what happened in New York in 1969 in California. Equally, there were precursors in the student uprisings in France and Italy in 1968. By the early 1970s, across the Western world, there was this explosion of a movement demanding something more than polite acceptance and polite tolerance, but demanding equality. And if there's one thing that probably brings together the ideas of the early gay liberation movement, it was essentially the very simple idea of coming out. Now, this is not, of course, something that is confined to any particular culture. Most of you are probably aware that in your own cultures, to declare oneself as homosexual is often a complicated and difficult journey that involves dealing with expectations from your family, expectations from society, expectations in countries where religion is important from religious leaders. At the time that gay liberation began, homosexuality was widely regarded as an illness, a sin, or a crime. And as an Australian, I share with you the legacy of the British Empire, which was, of course, to make homosexual behaviour between men a criminal offence. Something that I know was changed in Hong Kong, I think in the 1980s, but was a major issue and remains a major issue in many former British colonies. And in that sense, there's a way in which there is a link that connects all of us who come out of a particular imperial history where the idea of homosexuality as beyond appropriate behaviour was in fact legislated, which meant that people who were homosexual were forced to live hidden and disguised lives. And that, of course, remains the reality for most women and men in the world today who are homosexual. And one of the sad things that we see in the current world is that while Britain and some of its former colonies, such as both of ours, have removed those laws, there are parts of the former empire where, in fact, there is a strengthening of legal restrictions. It's particularly true in parts of Africa, in countries like Uganda, in Kenya, in Nigeria, in Ghana, where there is a quite marked and very vicious campaign going on that goes far beyond the original colonial era laws. But let me go back then to the experience of the early 70s. I stayed in New York long enough to get a contract to write a book. Those of you who've had the experience of trying to get a book contract will understand the complications. I have this memory. This, of course, is long before computers, long before word processors. I had things on typewritten, flimsy pages, and I walked from publishing house to publishing house in New York, hoping to find someone who would publish my first book. And luckily, I found a very small publisher who basically went out of business a year after they produced my book. I don't think this is cause and effect. And the book then got picked up by a number of other publishers. And I take some pride in the fact that it was retranslated and republished in Italy last year. And in May, I did a series of talks in Northern Italy talking about, as I'm talking to you today, but talking through an interpreter, because I don't speak good enough Italian to get beyond ordering the first course of a meal in a restaurant. I went back to Australia after my time in New York, and I went back and lived in Sydney in the 70s, then moved later on to Melbourne at a time when the gay movement was exploding. You probably are aware of the fact that Sydney is known for its annual lesbian and gay Mardi Gras. Some of you may even have been there. Certainly there is swarms of people from Asia tend to come to Sydney in February to take part in Mardi Gras. It was a very exciting period. It was a period in which all those strictures of the church, the law, the psychiatric profession were being attacked, and in which the various rules and regulations that had defined homosexuality as inferior were replaced gradually by new laws, new assumptions that accepted the diversity of human sexuality. More recently, of course, we're living through, at the moment, complicated and similar arguments about the flexibility of gender identity. When I look back on the lesbian and gay movement of the 1970s and 1980s, we were remarkably unaware, I think, of the reality of the trans experience. That is something that has come much more recently, and I'm aware of the fact that it's been an issue that has involved a number of court cases in Hong Kong. And you, of course, are not alone in this. Trans issues now are political dynamite in a number of countries, and you're probably aware of the fact that it is something that Donald Trump and the American Republican Party used in extraordinarily vicious ways in the last US presidential campaign. But I think that if we look back, what is striking is not, I think, just those changes, but to ask, why was it possible? What happened that made it possible for a new generation of people to assert their identities and to bring about major social, political, and cultural transformation? And I think that there are changes that are both specific to Western countries, but they're also universal. One of the things that is often forgotten is that while there was the emergence of a gay movement in the countries of the Atlantic world, of the US, Canada, Western Europe, there were also movements emerging in Latin America. There were early gay liberation movements in Argentina, in Mexico, in Brazil. There was, I think, a number of shifts going on in the world that over time became universalized. And as they became universalized, took on, of course, the specific contours of different cultures. And my own involvement with moving outside what I call the Atlantic world, even though, of course, it's a bit odd to think of Australia as part of the Atlantic world, but culturally we, in effect, are. My main involvement in this came through the AIDS epidemic. I went back at various points in my life to live in the United States, and I was living in New York again in the early 1980s, which is the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. I can well remember the enormous fear that every gay man felt as these stories started coming out about an incurable, unknown disease. Nobody knew what caused it. What was clear was that if you contracted it, you were almost certainly going to die, and you were going to die a pretty horrible death. And that, in fact, remained the case from the early 1980s through to the late 1990s, at which point effective antiretroviral drugs became effective. And when I went back to Australia, I did actually write, and this is what I do, of course, I'm a writer. I wrote an early book about the epidemic when I was in New York. I went back to Australia, and I think perhaps the most interesting thing that has happened to me is I became involved in the regional response to the new epidemic. And for a time, I had the very glamorous title of being president of the AIDS Society of Asia and the Pacific. It's a very glamorous title that describes a very small organization. But what it meant was direct contact with people across the region where the reality of the new epidemic also gave the impetus for a new possibility of organizing around sexuality. And I remember very many stories. And, again, this is the problem. When you get old, you like telling stories and you bore people sometimes with them. But I remember the first regional conference in Delhi in, I think, 1992, when the organisers refused to allow a gay caucus to meet in the official conference setting. So the gay boys all went to the nearby park, which, as it turned out, was famous as a cruising ground for homosexual men in Delhi. I'm not sure if we knew that consciously at the time, but there seems something very appropriate that was where a new network began. And out of that meeting came an extraordinary variety of organizations, networks, movements that linked people really across the whole of the Asian region. And I was talking to Travis before that I'd had quite a lot of contact in that period with the Hong Kong AIDS Foundation, which was one of the foundation members of the AIDS Society of Asia and the Pacific. Now, in contemporary studies that usually come under the rubric of queer studies, there seem to me to be two extraordinary gaps. One is the dominance of queer studies is a very, very North Atlantic centred view. I actually see queer studies as essentially an American academic invention inspired by a desire to keep up with contemporary French philosophy. And I love giving the example that one of the early products was a book called Fear of a Queer Planet by Michael Warner, in which, in fact, there's no reference to anywhere outside the United States, because for an American, the planet is the United States. I've just had to review a manuscript for a publisher for a book that talks about global queer. But in fact, apart from one sentence about Singapore and a passing reference to Uganda, the book is entirely about Europe and North America. And I think that there's a real challenge for us in this part of the world to take on the dominance of the Atlantic centrism of queer theory. But the other thing that strikes me, and you probably guessed what I've already said, is the increasing gap between people who talk about sexuality and people who talk about the AIDS epidemic. Whereas in fact, in many parts of the world, the AIDS epidemic opened up possibilities for research, for organising, for funding. I'm most familiar with how that was played out in some of the countries of Southeast Asia, particularly Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines. And you might have picked up from the three countries I've mentioned something I was discussing with Travis before, which is the enormous importance of English as the language of international organising, and the disadvantage for the great majority of people in the world who do not have access. The international AIDS conferences, of which I've been to far too many, are essentially run entirely as monolingual exercises, which means that people from countries, again, we come back to the common imperial link, people from India, people from Singapore, people from Malaysia, people from East Africa have an advantage that allows them in a way that is not possible for many people in this part of the world. Let's move then to where we are in the 21st century, because basically what I've been reflecting on is very much a product of the previous century. And one thing that's happened most notably in the last decade or so is that sexuality, sexual rights, sexual freedoms have become issues of international relations. Gradually, under pressure from a number of countries, the United Nations has taken up the rights of sexual minorities and people of diverse gender identities. And it's worth noting that the leadership in putting these issues on the international agenda has often come from countries like Brazil and South Africa. It is not necessarily a first world Western idea. South Africa, after all, was the first country, when they became independent, to include sexuality as a protected right in their constitution. Many of the countries of Latin America have led in recognition of a whole range of sexual and gender rights. But what we're seeing today is an increasing polarization between countries that are supporting and arguing for sexual and gender rights and countries that are resisting. One of President Putin's defenses for his invasion of Ukraine was that it was to prevent the spread of LGBT ideology. this might seem very far-fetched, but there is in fact a lot of documentary evidence of the way in which this has been quite consciously used in Russian propaganda. And in the various organs of the United Nations, particularly in the Human Rights Committee, there are ongoing tensions and battles between those countries that want to extend rights to include sexual and gender diversity and those countries that claim to defend traditional moralities. So that in a sense, what I think has happened over the last half century is that movements that began as essentially the expressions of a new generation who said, we don't have to live in the closet, we don't have to hide, we have equal rights with everybody, has now become a topic of international concern, a topic that is debated in international arenas. And I guess what I would want to stress is that it is not a simple matter of rich versus poor. It's not a simple matter of the West versus the rest. The United States, after all, has just elected an administration that is marked by extreme hostility to trans issues. Interestingly, I don't think Donald Trump has any views on any of these matters. I mean, Donald Trump, I think, is totally open to whatever will work for him tomorrow. But the United States, which likes to see itself as the world leader in global rights, is clearly going to withdraw in very obvious ways from some of the issues around sexuality and gender. And at the same time, as I said, we see in some of the countries of particularly of South America, but also in some parts of Asia, we see countries that are moving forward. Marriage equality is no longer something that only exists in Western countries. And battles over the right for same-sex couples to marry, which I know is a right that has not yet been achieved in Hong Kong, is in many parts of the world now seen as a landmark for how far there is general social acceptance. When I look back to what we tried to do, when I look back to the early days of gay liberation, small groups of people bravely marching in the street at a time when they were actually proclaiming that they were criminal, they were deviant, they were ill, they were sinners. When I look back, what remains? And I think what remains is that the great contribution was to actually enlarge our view and society's larger view of sexuality, to understand that diversity is a strength, not a weakness, and that generations of people who had spent their lives trying to hide essential parts of their being, who had given up their hope for fulfillment, suddenly were able to live as they wanted to live. And that, I think, is a pretty important achievement, and is an achievement that I think goes far beyond the confines of a particular movement. Now, I deliberately decided I'd stop. It's 25 to 5, and I wanted to give people lots of chance to make comment or ask questions.